Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room have heard of Ballerina before now? A couple of hands for roughly about half the room. Excellent. How many of you have done anything more sophisticated than Hello World with Ballerina? Oh, good. This talk is for you. Because I'm not going to be able to get into the full depths. I mean, Ballerina is a full-fledged programming language in its own right. It definitely derives from the object functional languages that we're familiar with. So assuming you know Java, you'll recognize a lot of the syntax. But it's a full-fledged programming language. And one of the things to be aware of is that there are going to be some constructs in Ballerina that behave a little differently, even though they look the same. They behave a little differently than what they do in Java. So there's two basic ways to approach this talk, right? One is to, hey, I'm going to show you all of the language constructs, and we're going to show you lots of little snippets and so on and so forth. And quite frankly, it's pedestrian. It works. But one of the things that I often like to do is I like to try to create a stalking horse, sort of an evaluation function, if you will, for new programming languages by doing something that is non-trivial, but also theoretically within that language's space. So one of the things that I did with Ballerina fairly early on, how many people are familiar with the game tic-tac-toe? Noughts and crosses, I believe, is what they call it over here, right? And you have to talk with that snooty accent when you do it, right? Yeah. So I created a open project called Tic-Tac-Toe REST to try to explore Ballerina's appropriateness for building a non-trivial RESTful service, in this case around the fairly trivial domain of tic-tac-toe. Okay. Now, the goal that I set myself for here deliberately was several-fold. Number one, I wanted to actually start from an interoperability perspective, because part of the whole point of REST and part of the whole point of Ballerina is to really stress the idea of building services, and services are really all about interoperability. One of the things I remember from the 2000s timeframe, early 2000s, if anybody here remembers writing code around then, we had Java, we had Microsoft, we had .NET, and they each claimed interoperability through web services, right? WSDL and SOAP and all of that stuff. And they claimed that you could walk up to your favorite Java code, run a tool, and WSDL would emerge, and then the other guys, capital T, capital O, capital G, could then run whatever their tool was and get code out on their end, and it would all just work magically. And the problem was, whenever you started from your language's source code, it would frequently turn into things that would be expressed through the WSDL that went, by the time it got to the other guys, it was a disaster. It was a complete CF of code, particularly because, for example, in .NET, dates are a value type. They're like primitive types, whereas in Java, of course, they are reference types. We can have null dates, but you can't really have a null date in the .NET, and that's where things just started to go south. It got worse, way worse from there. So in order to maximize interoperability, we often say we want to start from the middle and build something that describes both sides, right? In other words, we want to build a contract. Contract first web services was what it was called back in the day. Today, if we talk about REST services, if we talk about how do I build a REST service using this sort of contract-first approach, Open API. So the goal was to find an Open API description of a tic-tac-toe service. I did not actually write it. I just Googled, found one, borrowed it, and put it at the core of my project here as a YAML file. Now, those of you who have never looked at OpenAPI, don't try to read this, okay? This is a ridiculously verbose way of describing an endpoint, but fundamentally, all of the traditional contract-first things will be here. We need to describe an endpoint. So here, for example, we see a path called games, /games. that has a verb get, that has some little documentation here that says we're trying to get a list of all the games. And here are the possible responses. You can get a 200 back, meaning show me, I'm showing a particular game, and the content will be JSON, and in particular, the JSON schema dictates that this will be an array of game types. Okay? Now, if you've never heard of a game type, that's because it's defined further down in this contract. So we scroll further down past the endpoints, we see components here. These are basically your type definitions in an open API definition. So there are schemas, here is a game, and notice there are some required fields, ID, player 1, player 2, board, and message, where player 1 and player 2 are basically going to be strings, as we can see here, player 1 string, player 2 string. Board is an array, empty items, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So OpenAPI is currently the standard in many respects. And I say standard not in the sense that everybody has agreed to use this, but standard in the sense that those people who are looking for agreement between various platforms have kind of sort of said, yeah, OpenAPI does it. So the goal here, as I said, was to take this YAML file and use Ballerina to build out a tic-tac-toe REST server and see how much code it requires. Because the whole point of Ballerina really is to specifically be a programming language designed for exactly that task. I wanted to find a language that would actually be service-oriented from the bottom up, not an object-oriented language that has a framework that lets you build services, not a functional language that has a framework that lets you build services, but an actual service-oriented language. And Ballerina was one of the first ones that I found. Okay? So, Ballerina describes itself, general purpose, concurrent, strongly typed, both text and graphical syntaxes. And let me show you what that means. If we go off to the Ballerina website, you see this display here. WSO2, the manufacturer, the vendor, I don't know what we call them these days. It's not like they sell it, it's an open source project. But they very much, when they designed this language, they very much wanted something that could round trip between both a textual representation that we as programmers are familiar with, as well as a graphical representation. And from talking with the PM of the Ballerina environment, he said part of what we wanted from this was the ability to do a certain amount of visualization of code moving through one of these sort of flowchart things. I said, I've never historically felt really great about using flowchart programming languages. He's like, yeah, no, we get it. And really, this is intended for people who are not programmers because generally speaking, that will be faster to author in many respects. But this does a couple of things. This helps them address some of the low-code, no-code environment. There are a lot of folks, particularly management types, for whom that is a checkbox to be ticked off before we can actually move forward with the project. The other thing is that this will enable them, because they can round trip, you change some code here, this graph will update and vice versa. That gives them the ability to do some visualizations of a running system, okay? They also then have a cloud system that is designed to host Ballerina services. And I always forget the name of it. Let me go to WSO2. Come on, show me the name here quickly. Yes, I accept all the cookies, go away. Thanks, Europe, for GDPR. Just one up, there it is, Choreo. So Choreo is their API manager for choreographing. You got it, yeah. So anyway, we are not going to be spending any time looking at this graphical syntax. We're going to be looking all at the textual representation. But just keep in mind that Choreo likes to be able to show you this, and if you chose to, you could conceivably author in this, okay? Getting Ballerina, pretty straightforward, right? We go here to the download link. Notice the current version, 2201.5.0, Swan Lake. As you might well imagine, all of the releases are codenamed for ballet. I asked them where did the name Ballerina come from, and either it's a corporate secret or they don't remember. But this is the name of the language, and so they chose to run with that and call everything after famous ballets. Okay? The previous release, if I remember correctly, was Nutcracker, and I can't remember what the one before that was. So they update on roughly a quarterly basis. And usually the leading number is like a major build number. It's not quite semantic versioning, but here you can see this is the 5th update of Swan Lake, which is 2201. Okay, I believe this means that Swan Lake was released in January of 22. Okay, they're definitely approaching a point of stability. This is not one of those languages that is still very much in churn and they're changing things, breaking syntax, et cetera. They're very committed to keeping this and everything background compatible or backwards compatible. There is a Visual Studio Code extension which you can download and grab. Again, if you are on a different platform, such as the Mac, such as what I'm on, Homebrew is your friend. Brew install BAL. And lo and behold, you now have Ballerina on your machine. Okay? BAL, by the way, BAL is the name of the tool. So if I say BAL version, we can see it coming back as 2201.5. Okay? BAL as a tool will be sort of your entry point into, just like we now have with a lot of other languages. For example, if you're doing C#, there is the .NET tool. So you use .NET to initialize a new project, use it to build, use it to test, use it to do a variety of different things, packaging. BAL serves the same purpose for Ballerina. So a lot of what I'll be doing is BAL build, BAL test, BAL release, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a build tool and package manager rolled into the language, the platform. They also have BAL format, which will pretty print all of your Ballerina code into the accepted format. Okay? So let's go back real quick. Things you really need to know. Services. Ballerina is not an object-oriented language any more than C# or Java is a procedural language. Okay? Most object languages will incorporate procedural type programming. We have functions, they can take parameters, they can return values, et cetera, et cetera. So Ballerina does have objects, but generally speaking, the focus here for Ballerina is not to build a class. The focus here is you want to build a service. Service is the first class construct for Ballerina. You would not use this language to program your favorite game of, I don't know, World of Warcraft or something similar. This is not a user interface language. This is definitely intended for services and backend. So there's some debate. I got into this discussion at one point with some of the folks. Is this really a general purpose programming language if it can't do anything front end? And they were very quick to point out that because Ballerina in its current incarnation runs on top of the JVM. So fundamentally, when I build some Ballerina code, it will turn into a jar file, which can then be executed. And if I dig deep enough, I can see the Ballerina runtime, which is a series of utility libraries that then augment what's on top of the standard JVM, provide some additional functionality, blah, 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 blah. The long-term plan was for Ballerina to eventually become its own platform, to eventually compile to native code with its own virtual machine, et cetera. But it seems like they're changing some of those long-term directions, probably simply because it's a ton of work to actually do all of that. And the JVM works very, very well. So knowing that, if you chose to, if you wanted to use Ballerina to build some user interface stuff, you could always FFI, foreign function interface, to Java Swing, if you really, really wanted to build a game in Swing. And if you really wanted to build a game in Swing, you have bigger problems. Okay? Concurrency within a service should be easy and default, and as a matter of fact, there should be some compile time support for it, so that in fact the compiler can provide some additional information about whether or not my code is thread safe or not. We'll see some of this as we start looking at my tic-tac-toe code. Observability should just be plumbing. I shouldn't have to go and write a bunch of code to get observability as a part of my application. It really should just be part of what's there. In the same way that Java made memory management just part of the plumbing. It just happens. And it may not happen exactly the way you want it, but 99% of the time, it's what you want. And if you really, really, really wanted to get in and tweak it, you probably could. I've never tried. Functions and explicit state are sufficient. That is to say, we support objects, but Ballerina is not going to support all of the features that we see in a modern object-oriented language because Ballerina is not an object-oriented language. I'm going to just keep coming back to that and hammering it home because I think that is one of the key things to understand when you walk into this. You can bring some of your design patterns, some of your thinking about how we approach things in an object manner, but really you're better suited if you spend some time with one of the object functional hybrid languages. If you spend some time with Scala, if you spend some time with F# over in the .NET space, maybe some Clojure, although Clojure is a Lisp is always its own weird thing, okay? All right. Core entities. Service is a collection of network accessible entry points. A resource is a single entry point within a service. Isolation and transactions are part of the concurrency support that Ballerina provides. And then strands. They're not threads, boys and girls. They're strands. And of course, Java is introducing fibers. And sooner or later, we're going to run out of rope-like metaphor words. But, okay? So again, this is just kind of a terminology check there. So I'll show you Hello World and then we'll dive into the tic-tac-toe code. So if you want to play around with Ballerina, one thing you can do is you can go to play.ballerina.io. This is becoming very popular for a lot of new languages to provide you a space here where in fact I can just tool around and do some things and then run the code and there we see the results, okay? So what we can see from this code, and let me blow it up a little bit. So first of all, we see the familiar import statement that we've seen in so many different languages over the years, but notice Ballerina /io as opposed to dot, just simply a syntactic choice on their part. This is, as the name implies, this is a part of the standard Ballerina library, and what this does is this actually brings those elements into the top level namespace. Because one of the things that Ballerina, again, being a service-oriented language, not being an object language, being very comfortable with the idea that not everything needs to be inside of a class, has top-level functions. So here we see the use of IO println. Notice IO matches the package there. Notice the colon, that's the namespacing scoping operator. And then println, hello Ballerina. Notice main is just a function. It's just floating out there in space. Public meaning it's accessible from other modules, okay? Pretty straightforward stuff. Let us turn our attention. So, first and foremost, let's see. Do I still have, yeah, here. So again, remember, from my YAML file, I've got these endpoints, /gamesget, okay? What I would do, which I've already done, obviously, but if I run the bal tool, we can see that it has some options here to be able to, typical build commands, clean the artifacts. We can new up a package, initialize a Ballerina package in an existing directory, add a new module to the current package, etc. And one of these, let's see, I believe it's the open API command here, will tell us that this can actually either generate Ballerina source or export an open API definition from a Ballerina service. So again, this is one of these classic tools that will tell you, if you give me some code, I'll give you the contract. You give me the contract, I'll give you some code, okay? So if you were to take my YAML file and you were to run bal OpenAPI, I believe it's client or service gen, and it will generate a series of Ballerina stubs. As a matter of fact, let's see. I'm going to just create a quick directory and bal open API input tic-tac-toe YAML, and I want to put this into -o. And go. So it generated 4 files: TTT service, which it derived from the name of the YAML file, client, utils, and types. Okay. Now, one of the things that I found that I'm a little frustrated with Ballerina about is, here we go, temp, is in some respects, it doesn't do a great job with the code generation about being able to support the idea of needing, like if the contract changes, to regen the code, because a lot of this sort of assumes that I'm going to go ahead and write the code directly inside of here, right? Back when we were doing the whole Java contract thing, usually it would generate interfaces to serve, and then you implemented the interface and went from there. So I gave them that bit of feedback, and they said, thank you for your feedback, which usually means you can stop talking now because we've stopped listening. Okay, maybe in a future release they'll change that up. I do get they have a variety of other things that they need to worry about. But notice here, we've got service / on EP0. Okay, services are always bound to some form of networking endpoint, and there right above it, we can see reference to a listener of type HTTP listener EP0 equals new. Well, notice that we don't actually specify the type because it's implied by the left-hand side there. And 9090 is probably a port number, and config is probably some kind of name-value pair mapping. It's a map. In this case, host being localhost. So notice we're already including, I mean, literally from the third line, we see something that is syntactically similar to Java, but still very, very different. Because now we specify that the service on that listener, service /, in other words, this is the root service, so you can already start to see where the REST paths are going to come from, the HTTP URL paths. And notice that we have a resource, which is a function using the get verb of HTTP, games, parens, that will map to the name that we saw expressed from the open API, and notice it returns an array of game. Okay? Create a new game. By the way, what we're seeing here with the hash, this is Ballerina doc, or BDoc, sometimes seems to be called. This is essentially Java doc for Ballerina. Notice that they do a slightly different syntax. First of all, the hash, or the £, or more formally known, the octothorpe. That's its official name, just in case you were curious. That's their comment syntax. Notice the plus payload plus return. That's their syntax for being able to describe the parameter and the return types, just like with JavaDoc. And if I do a baldoc, I will get some Ballerina formatted documentation, HTML files, just like JavaDoc does, that will pull and slurp all this out. And their code got this from my YAML file. Not my YAML file, somebody else's generously donated YAML file. ChatGPT created it. That way I can't be sued. That's my story from now on. Crap, I'm being recorded, aren't I? Yeah. Damn. Anyway, so notice that the return type is a game, could also be an HTTP bad request, HTTP method not allowed. In other words, you know, if for example, you are trying to access a game that has already been finished, or if you're trying to make a move when it's not your turn, et cetera, et cetera. Here we can see this comment describes the post of games, which takes a HTTP payload, notice the annotation there, the attribute, of a game's body type payload. And notice that it can return either a game or a bad request or a method not allowed. Okay? Ballerina supports unions, and specifically using unions to describe types. So here, rather than having to come up with some overly generic base class and using inheritance to signal these three things, Ballerina says you can get one of these three things. And by the way, this will all be compile time enforced. Obviously, we can't do it because this is the entry point, so I can't compile time against whatever HTTP package somebody wants to give me. But any code further down, as we dive into this code more deeply, it will make sure that, okay, if you're going to be handing back a game, let me make sure that this function, in fact, returns game. Okay? A couple other things as we go. Here I want to get a list of games, or I want to get the game given by a particular identifier. Notice the bracketed syntax that indicates that this is actually a parameter to the endpoint. So now if I ask for games/1, the parameter here ID will be filled with the value 1. And then lastly, to make a move on a game. I mean, fundamentally, a tic-tac-toe game is pretty straightforward. Give me a list of all the games, give me a particular game, right? And let me make a move in a game. The end. That's all we're really trying to do, right? List, create, find more specifically, and update. I didn't support any notion of delete because, again, that wasn't in the Open API. When we look at the types here, well, we see a whole bunch of stuff, right? This specifically is a connection configuration. Notice record here. This is a record type, similar to what has been introduced in other languages, cough, cough, Java, right? The idea is this is essentially a structure of values, not intended to be a full-fledged class. Here is our proxy. Most of this stuff up here is all standard boilerplate type stuff that may be useful in the listeners and so forth. Here we see an OK game. Here we see the game array. This is essentially an alias. Here we see my record type game. And notice string player 1, string player 2, any data array board, because the Open API doesn't specify what the actual contents of this will look like. So it just says you can put anything you want as long as it's in an array of. We could probably tighten that up. We could probably say that this should be an array of strings, or this should be an array of square objects, where a square is a thing that is described as either being a player 1 token or a player 2 token or empty. But, at a certain point, the goal here is just to get an idea of how Ballerina works. And notice that some of these have these little question marks after them. That indicates that they're nullable, they're optional, because it is entirely possible for us to have a tic-tac-toe game with no winner. And if we have a winner, that means we don't have a player whose move it is, because the game is over. Okay? So, Ballerina will in fact make sure that when you access one of these optional nullable types, that in fact you're doing so and checking for null appropriately. Right? This is one of, I think, the things that many language designers have since come to regret, is the whole null thing. You guys know the story behind null, yeah? The guy who invented null recently, Sir Tony Hoare, was knighted by the Queen, if I remember right, about 5, 6, 7 years ago for his contributions to computer science, and in his acceptance speech said, yeah, null was my billion-dollar mistake. And based on just the sheer number of null pointer exceptions I've gotten in my career, I think he's underselling it. I think it's probably more like $1 trillion. But anyway, what we see here again is these are just straight record types. These are structural types that will say, if you give me something that contains 2 strings, then cool, it's a games body and off we go. One of the things that Ballerina supports is what we call structural typing, as opposed to semantic typing. If I have a class, well, let's call it person, that currently has a string, and an int in it, right? First name, last name, and age. And if I have another class in Java called city, name, state, and then zip code, right? Or postal code, perhaps over here, string, int. Well, Java considers these to be 2 separate and distinct types because they are each named differently. This is why it's often referred to as nominative typing as well. Ballerina says, however, hey, string, int, if you want to convert a string, int into another string, int, go, boo. You do you. Okay? So structural typing actually makes a tremendous amount more sense when we start thinking about, when we're slinging JSON back and forth. There is no type safety to JSON. And so if I want to see a string int in JSON, sure, give me a string int. And I don't necessarily care what the fields are named. I might in some cases, but in a lot of cases I won't. There's also a utils file here to help deal with URLs. Kind of not interesting. There's also some client code over here to make it useful to call the endpoint described by this OpenAPI file. So Ballerina will actually help you generate code to be on the calling side, because what is the thing that many of our services do? They call other services. Okay? Now this is all the generated code. Let's look at some of the stuff that I wrote. So I started with that same service.bal. And there are a couple of other things I wanted to pull in, right? HTTP was pulled in already, IO, so I could do a little bit of spitting to the console. Log, Ballerina does have its own logging system because every good programming language today has one, or several in the case of Java, just to make things more fun. We'll see lang.value in a little bit, but this is a sub-package of this lang module. And notice that I have a function here called init. One of the things, I've been deliberately calling them packages or modules. One of the things that Ballerina stresses is the idea that modules, this is sort of the package of containment and delivery, it's a fully fledged entity. And so we can initialize, we can run some code as soon as the module gets loaded into the VM. And that's essentially what that init method does. It's a special name, okay? And here all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, the initializer is firing, everything is complete. Notice I set up a listener on port 9090, and then obviously I've put some additional comments around this. But here we can see, for example, the getGames function returns a game array. Now one of the things I wanted to do with this example is I wanted to try to keep relatively closely to the way a larger, more formal project would be structured. So first of all, I did not just want to keep the array in memory. What happens if I need to restart the service? What happens if the server reboots? What happens if I don't pay my AWS bill and they shut off the incoming HTTP? What happens? In memory, I lose all those games. So where do you store those games? Of course, you store it in a database, right? Now, I also don't want to get ridiculously absurd about this. So the database, I'm using an H2 straight single file database, very common for a lot of the Java demos that we see in the world, right? So I know that I want to eventually write some code to the database because Ballerina has support for JDBC and being able to issue some SQL calls, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously I don't want to do it from here because I'd like to take that more layered based approach. So I deliberately broke this out into 3 layers, even though it was a little overkill. The lowest level is responsible for doing the persistence to and from the database. The middle tier is responsible for implementing all of the business logic of a tic-tac-toe game. And then this first layer is basically the ingress layer. Any sort of parameter validation that wasn't already handled by the generated Ballerina code goes here. So here, what I do is I first of all log that I'm getting /games, and then I am calling getGames. Well, let's see, where is getGames? These are all the service endpoints here. But what Ballerina will do when it compiles these is it will look at the other things that are present inside of the current directory. So TTT service will call functions, which in turn has a function called getGames that returns the game array or an error. This is how Ballerina ducks the whole checked versus unchecked exceptions thing. It says there are no exceptions. There's no such thing as an exception. Fundamentally, you either are giving back good data or you're giving back an error. And you'll notice error there is colored differently. This is in fact a type that Ballerina understands and can compile check and make sure that anybody that's getting back one of these checks to make sure that we are dealing with the error case. And inside of here, we can see that all I do is gamedb.retrieve, And if we go into the GameDB bal, here's where we see the JDBC code. So I'm opening the database, JDBC h2 file dot, and I'm going to execute some SQL.
What's check?
Check is checking to see if there's an error. It's exactly what it is. Yep. Right? So what it does essentially is it checks to see if there's an error, and if there's no error, it returns to you the other part of the union, essentially. Right? So in this particular case here, because creating the JDBC client could yield an error because potentially the JDBC database over a network doesn't exist or doesn't like your login information or what have you, I have to check that. And then I have to check when I do the execute against the JDBC client. And then I have to check when I do the execute to actually create the table. And notice all of this is occurring inside of a init, inside of a class, because I decided it just by fiat, I wanted to be able to have multiple game databases at the same time if I really chose to. Did you have a question? Okay.
So there is error handling at the end of the day.
Well, you can't just say there will be no errors and do a little Jedi mind trick and the programmers are all perfect, right? You just don't get to do that. We have to have some kind of error handling functionality. But the biggest problem with checked exceptions, you got to understand, about 15 years ago, Venkat Subramaniam and a couple of other no-fluff speakers from the States were over here in London doing another conference, and we literally closed down a pub one night arguing at the top of our lungs between checked and unchecked exceptions. This has been a kind of a contentious topic in the Java and in the language design community as a whole, because checked exceptions mean you as the developer have to deal with all of these possible things that can go wrong, and what do you as the developer do, especially if you're focused on being a productive developer? You say catch exception / to do. Fix this someday. Right? That was their argument. But what's the problem with unchecked exceptions? You don't even bother with the empty catch block. You let the user tell you when your code has crashed. Which is better? Which is worse? I don't know. We had a lot of fun arguing, but we came to no real answers. Ballerina says, look, at the end of the day, we will put some compile time checking around the use of the error type. And so the balance of that is the check keyword. But beyond that, they're not exceptions.
So you won't be able to throw a runtime exception explicitly in the language. You can get it only when calling external functions.
Ballerina uses a different error handling mechanism to signal an error. Let's see, do I have a... No, this is why we're doing this as code instead of just slides, because it's interactive, right? And this way I can just tell you when you're wrong, and you know. I don't think I do... Let's see, I thought somewhere in here, like if they make an illegal move, I flag an error, but I don't see it. Oh, here it is. So here, right, I don't throw an exception, I just return an error, right? And now the client has to handle the fact that an error was returned. So it's kind of like throwing an exception, but it doesn't change the standard control flow.
But do you have a construct to actually throw an unchecked exception from Ballerina code?
Can I throw a Java unchecked exception? Well, again, Ballerina doesn't have exceptions. So it's kind of like saying, can Ballerina create for me a unicorn that poops rainbows? No, it doesn't have it, right? So I could conceivably write some Java code, call it for Ballerina, and have it throw an exception. But I'm not sure what the point would be at that point. Good? All right, so, yes?
A lot of the lines on the previous code you're looking at began underscore equals. What's that all about?
So, like here. So one of the things that Ballerina wants to stress is the idea that if a function returns a value, you must capture it. You must capture it. But in this particular case, I don't need that returned value. Because, for example, the return value from the JDBC client execute is to tell me how many rows were changed. I don't care. So the underscore is, what's that? Yeah, the underscore is the universal. We see this in a number of languages. The underscore is basically a wildcard that says, whatever. I'm capturing it. I'm deliberately ignoring the return value as opposed to accident. The last time I tried this, I believe it would not compile. But if you really, really, really want to put me to the wall, we can try compiling it without it and see what happens. In the back.
What's the type difference of the variable, whether you call check or not?
So the type difference, let me... So let's see. I want to try to find where they specifically describe check. That is not it. That's operators and whatnot. I think it is an expression. Record, no. All right. What we're looking at here is the Ballerina guide. There is also a full Ballerina specification for the language. We could go diving into that to find some, what I remember, and memories are always, fallible things. What I remember is the check keyword, when I get the return value from a function, assuming it's not an error, it will strip the or error off of the union. Right? So that then what you get back is not the okay or error, you get just the okay. Does that make sense?
But what if it's an error then?
If it's an error, well, that's why I was going to try and find this, because I wanted to distinctive language features, language walkthrough. No, I don't want videos. The truth of the matter is, it's been a while, I don't remember. I believe what it does is it hands back the error. Basically, it's an either or type, but I don't remember exactly how they manage that. So, anyway, yeah, it's, I believe it's on like specs.ballerina.io, something like that. Anyway. Okay, where were we? So, kind of working from the bottom up, we can see this is some of our JDBC code, right? So here the board, whoops, no, go away. The board I'm just creating as an array of strings, the idea being that each player name, essentially their, X or O, their name, their handle, whatever, will be what we put into this array in the classic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, going across left to right, top down, right? Notice that there is a time module with the UTC now for the created at part of the payload. And then I do a parameterized query so that I don't accidentally open myself up to any sort of SQL injection attacks and so forth. Notice the string interpolation support here to go grab those values. The execution result, again, dealing with this, assuming that it's a legitimate result. Notice that what I get back here, insert ID, the result, the last insert ID is a integer or string question mark, and essentially I can do a type test here. If this is an int, return the insert ID. If it's a string, then it means somehow the insert failed, so therefore hand back a integer value of -1, okay? Querying for a game here, we just grab the game object that comes back. And at this point, there may be a part of you that says, well, hang on a second. I don't see anywhere here where you take the JDBC result set, that row, and convert it to a game. I don't have to. Because of structural typing, what I get back from this query for a given row is a tuple. And that tuple will structurally line up to be a game object. So as long as the fields in the tuple match the fields in the game, I'm good, boo. by name. But it will compile time check. It will check. It will absolutely make sure that they are the same. Okay?
But the name of the column in the database should be the name of the field,
Yes. Yes.
not position.
Not positional. No, I believe it does it by name. Okay? Now, a couple other things to look at as we go through this. Let's see. Most of this is pretty much similar code to what we've talked about before. You'll notice that a lot of these have the keyword isolated associated with this here. This is part of the concurrency check. It will actually trace this all the way down to my game database code to make sure that this is in fact isolated from anything that another thread may access at the same time. And if it's not, that was one of the most difficult parts. I actually had to really grab the Ballerina team's ear to say, what am I doing wrong here, guys? Because it's a little subtle, and there are places where it really felt like the code should work, but I wasn't getting the right magic incantation correct in order to make, but in this, I finally got it at a certain point. They helped me walk through certainly, because it was actually looking at, for example, how this for loop was working and determined, they said, well, notice how if you're updating it here, technically it could be updating someplace else. So that's why you're violating the isolation guarantee. Oh, okay. So if I make copies, yeah, that would be great. Okay, so again, the compiler is going through here to really make sure that there is as much concurrency guarantee at compile time as they can give. Now, no programming language, particularly one that's intended for real usage, would really be complete, I should say programming platform, unless they have some form of testing facility, right? And so, again, I can create because I broke this out into multiple levels, I have tests here. So here are my service tests that will say, let me test all of the games. So I make use of a HTTP client and I say get / and then I look at the payload, make sure it's a text payload, and then I print it and say it's okay. Because I was not interested in creating bulletproof tests. I was interested in just knowing that I could create tests, okay? You will also see this test config here. And if you go back for a second, if we go back to GameDB, notice that the username and the password are marked as configurable. What's one of the things we often have to do with services in production or in test, or we have to have some external storage where things like secrets are stored. So Ballerina has explicitly elevated that to a language level construct. Configurable as a modifier means, well, you can either work with the default here, or you can see it passed in as an environment variable, or it can show up inside of this config.toml file. Okay? And notice here is where I also specify the log level for the logging, for all those log println statements. There are actually two config.toml files, right? And this is because the server describes one module, whereas the tests describe a different module. So I can have a config for each. Okay? There's also a couple other of these toml files here. Let's see. First is the Ballerina toml. This is the top level markup language configuration file for Ballerina as a whole. So here we can see which distribution we're using, what the name, the org, the version number. Notice that build options, I include observability. I would like there to be some observability. That's the only thing. I can flip that to false easily enough, but that's the only thing that will actually, I am required to do to add some metrics and monitorability to my application, to my tic-tac-toe application. Oh, and this other thing here, platform Java 11 dependency, that's where I get the H2 database from, so it'll automatically download it and pull it in, just like your Gradle or your Maven will do. But notice in between them, cloud equals Docker. This is the fun part. This is the part I love the most. So if I come back here to Bal and I say bal.build, uh-oh, where am I? Oh, yes, I have to be inside of bal.build. Take two. So downloading that jar file, compiling the source. The Ballerina compiler is not the fastest thing in the world. That is probably the biggest drawback I have found to it, is that it does take a while to compile this stuff. And then it builds the Docker image. So it is downloading all of the necessary bits so that now I can run this locally, or I can take this image and ship it up to pick your favorite cloud here. That to me is huge, absolutely huge, because it's formal recognition of the fact that today we don't actually ship jar files anymore, right? I mean, Java's gone through a pretty interesting evolution. In the beginning, we thought you're just going to copy a whole bunch of .class files over to the right place on a directory path tree, and then you were going to produce jar files, and then, well, you'll produce a whole bunch of jar files, or jar files will contain jar files, the whole enterprise archives and all that good stuff. Now it's all Docker. And Ballerina says, you know what? I'll just build the Docker image for you, make sure all the dependencies are there, all the jar files are there, so that now you can just run this thing.
Maybe just a heads up, you're already...
Yep, give me 2 seconds. So now it's running. And, oops. This is a series of curl queries that go against that running service on port 9090. The interesting part about Ballerina, how long would it take you to build this service using any of the other things that we do using Java as the core language? Languages create first-class constructs that are relevant to the things that we want to think in. If you want to think in services, it's best to have a language that speaks services natively out of the box. Peace out.